The silver tea tray struck the marble floor so violently that every chandelier in the ballroom seemed to tremble. Porcelain shattered. Hot tea splashed across the polished marble. And the 52-year-old woman everyone called the useless unmarried aunt collapsed to her knees before the richest guests in England. For one breathless second, the room fell silent. Then her three beautiful nieces began to laugh. No wonder no man ever married her, one whispered loudly. She cannot even carry tea without making a widow of the cups, another said. Before the 52-year-old aunt could gather the broken pieces with her trembling hands, the wealthiest widowed duke in England rose from his chair. The entire ballroom watched as he walked past every young lady dressed in silk and diamonds, knelt beside the unmarried aunt, carefully picked up the shattered porcelain with her, then slowly rose to his feet and looked directly at the three mocking nieces. His voice was calm. "If marriage is proof of a woman's worth," he said, "then allow me to correct your mistake." The ballroom froze. By sunset, every unmarried beauty in England would be wiping tears from her lace handkerchief. Because the kingdom's most sought-after duke had just announced that he intended to court the very woman everyone believed was too old, too ordinary, and too forgotten to ever be chosen. But what none of them knew was this. He did not intend to fall in love with her. He only wanted to teach an ungrateful family, and all of society, a lesson they would never forget. Neither of them could have imagined that the greatest lesson would be the one his own heart was about to learn. Now, tell me honestly, if you watched your own family mock the woman who sacrificed her youth to raise them, would you forgive them after they came crawling back? Or would you make them live with their regret forever? Before we begin this unforgettable Victorian romance, subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. You never know, the next story might remind the world that it's never too late to be chosen. Thornhollow Manor woke at 4 in the morning, though only one woman inside it was awake to greet it. Theodosia Fenwick stood in the kitchen with her sleeves already rolled to the elbow, counting eggs into a wide ceramic bowl. 52 years old, gray threading through her dark hair at the temples, she moved through the cold kitchen like she had moved through it every morning for the last 30 years. The fire in the great hearth had not yet caught. Her fingers were stiff from the chill. She blew into her cupped hands, rubbed them together, and got back to work. 12 eggs for the cook's pudding, and 6 more for the omelet the young master will want before his ride, she murmured to herself. And someone will have forgotten the cream again. She was right. Someone had forgotten the cream. By 6, the manor had come alive with the ordinary chaos of a household preparing for the grandest day it had seen in a generation. Miss Araminta Thornhollow, the eldest niece and bride-to-be, was getting engaged that very evening to Mr. Bramwell Montclair, only son of a family whose name appeared in the London papers more often than the weather did. Servants ran up and down the main staircase carrying folded linens and vases of hothouse flowers. A cart from the village delivered ice for the punch. Somewhere upstairs, a dressmaker's assistant was shrieking about a torn hem. And in the middle of it all was Theodosia, doing 6 things at once. She arranged white roses in the entrance hall because the flower girl hired for the day had arrived with her hands shaking too badly to trust with the good vases. She calmed a young housemaid named Isolde, barely 17, who had dropped a candlestick and started to cry, certain she would be dismissed. "Nobody is dismissing you over a candlestick, dear," Theodosia said, crouching down to pick up the dented silver. "I dropped a whole tureen of soup on Lord Haverley's boots once. He still invited me to his hunting party the following autumn. Mostly, I suspect, to see if I would do it again." Isolde laughed despite herself, wiping her eyes. "Did you do it again, Miss Fenwick?" "I did not. I did something far worse. But that is a story for another morning." By 9, Theodosia had mended a torn tablecloth with stitches so fine no one would ever notice, settled a dispute between 2 footmen over whose task it was to polish the silver candelabra, and personally supervised the kitchen because, as the cook put it flatly, nobody does it as well as Aunt. Everyone trusted her. Nobody thought to ask how she was feeling. Her three older sisters swept through the manor that morning dressed already in their afternoon silks, far too occupied with greeting early arriving relatives to lift a single tray. Euphemia Thornhollow, the eldest and mistress of the house, stood in the drawing room accepting compliments about her daughter's engagement with the practiced grace of a woman who had spent decades perfecting her own importance. Gwendolyn Weatherby fussed over her own daughter Seraphina's gown. Honoria Haverley sat with a cup of chocolate, instructing a footman on precisely which chairs should face the garden. None of them noticed that Theodosia had not sat down once since 4 in the morning. Aunt Theodosia is a marvel, Euphemia told a visiting cousin, gesturing vaguely toward the kitchen. I do not know what this family would do without her. The cousin, an older woman with sharp eyes, glanced toward the kitchen doorway, where Theodosia could be seen instructing 2 kitchen boys on how to properly ice a cake. Has she never married, then? Oh, she was engaged once, briefly, years and years ago, Euphemia said, waving a gloved hand as though shooing away a fly. But then father took ill, and someone had to stay, and well, it simply became her role. The cousin said nothing further, though something in her expression suggested she understood exactly what became her role meant. At noon, Theodosia's nephew Caspian Thornhollow, 17 years old and fond of dry remarks, wandered into the kitchen and leaned against the doorframe, watching his aunt work. You know, Aunt Theodosia, he said, if the footman moved the dining table 3 feet to the left tomorrow, I believe you would still be standing in that exact spot at dinner, waiting for someone to hand you a task. Someone would, Theodosia said without looking up from the cake she was icing. It is usually you, dear. You are remarkably good at finding new tasks for me. Caspian laughed. Several relatives standing nearby laughed too. Theodosia laughed along with them, the way she always did, the way that had become as automatic as breathing. But underneath the laughter, something old and tired settled deeper into her chest. She had heard variations of this joke for 30 years. Part of the furniture. Always there. Never asked to leave, never asked to stay. Simply expected, the way a chair or a clock is expected to remain exactly where it was left. She had not always been the furniture. Once, she had been the youngest and, by her own sister's admission, the prettiest of the 4 Fenwick girls. She'd had a cheerful laugh that turned heads at church socials, and at least 3 respectable gentlemen had called on her father with serious intentions before she turned 23. She remembered dancing until her slippers wore thin. She remembered a young man named Ambrose who had once picked wildflowers for her from the hedgerow behind the chapel and pressed them, slightly crushed, into her palm. Then her father had suffered a stroke that left half his body useless and his speech slurred beyond recognition. Within months, her mother's joints had swollen so badly with arthritis that she could no longer dress herself. Someone needed to stay. The 4 sisters had gathered in the parlor the week after their father's stroke, and Theodosia still remembered every word of that conversation with painful clarity, the way one remembers the exact moment a door closes somewhere far off in a house. I cannot possibly manage it, Euphemia had said, twisting her handkerchief in her lap. The children are far too young. Caspian is barely walking, and the new baby will not sleep through the night as it is. My husband's business would collapse without me managing his correspondence, Gwendolyn had added quickly. You know how he is with figures, Theodosia. He would ruin us within a season. And my own household requires constant supervision, Honoria had said, not quite meeting anyone's eyes. The servants simply do not listen unless I am there every hour of the day. All 3 had turned, almost in unison, toward their youngest sister. You have no husband, no children, no household of your own to manage, Euphemia had said gently, as though this were a kindness rather than an accusation. It only makes sense that you should be the one to stay, Theodosia. Only for a little while, until father improves, or we find some more permanent arrangement. Theodosia had looked at three faces she loved and had said, because there had seemed nothing else to say, of course, I will stay. She had believed them that first year. She had believed the promise of turns, of shared burden, of a temporary arrangement that would resolve itself once their father's condition stabilized or their mother's hands grew steadier. Theodosia was the youngest. She was unmarried. The choice, as her sisters presented it, made itself. Only for a little while. Euphemia had promised her, squeezing her hands. Until father improves, or we can arrange something more permanent. We will all take turns, I promise you. The turns never came. Theodosia rose before dawn for 30 years to bathe her father, change his linens, feed him with a spoon when his hands shook too badly to hold one himself, and read to him in the evenings when the darkness pressed too heavily against his mind. She massaged her mother's swollen knuckles with warm oil every night before bed. She sat awake through fevers and coughing fits that lasted until sunrise. She learned to sleep in fragments, an hour here, 20 minutes there, snatched between one duty and the next. The gentleman who once called at the Fenwick house stopped calling. Ambrose married a girl from the next parish over within 2 years. The others assumed, reasonably enough, that a woman who never appeared anywhere unmarried had chosen a quiet, solitary life on purpose. She hardly noticed them leaving. There was no room in a day that began at 4 and ended past midnight to mourn men who had not thought her worth waiting for. When her father finally died, followed 18 months later by her mother, Theodosia believed, for one brief and foolish week, that her life might finally belong to her again. Instead, her sisters gathered in the parlor to discuss the inheritance. You understand, of course, Honoria had said gently, not unkindly, that Euphemia and Gwendolen and I have households and children to provide for. You have neither. She had patted Theodosia's hand as though comforting a child. The cottage on the east edge of the property should suit you very well, and you shall always be welcome here, of course. We could never do without you. Theodosia had accepted the small cottage without argument. Arguing had never gotten her anywhere in 30 years, and she doubted it would start working now. She was only 52, though the village had long ago decided her chances at marriage had expired sometime around her 40th birthday, along with her chances at nearly everything else worth wanting. The nieces and nephews she had helped raise, fed, nursed through fevers, and taught to read were grown now, some already married with children of their own. And still, whenever there was a christening, a birthday, a harvest feast, or, as today, an engagement celebration, the first person anyone sent for was still Aunt Theodosia. She baked the cakes. She mended the dresses. She calmed the frightened children and solved the unexpected problems and stayed until the very last carriage rolled away down the drive. Nobody asked her opinion on family matters. Nobody consulted her about the wedding plans forming that very afternoon, though she would be the one arranging the flowers, managing the kitchen, and quietly fixing whatever went wrong. She had become useful. She had stopped, somewhere along the way, being seen as a woman capable of being loved. On the morning of Araminta's engagement celebration, Theodosia woke feeling as though someone had filled her skull with hot sand. Her head pounded with every heartbeat. Her joints ached the way they only ached before a bad fever. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed for a long moment, both hands pressed to her temples, and considered, for one dangerous second, staying exactly where she was. Then she thought of Isolde and the flowers and the kitchen and the 100 small disasters that would unfold without her there to catch them, and she stood. If everyone enjoys themselves, she whispered to the empty room, buttoning her gray dress with fingers that trembled slightly, that will be enough. By the time she reached the manor, dawn had barely broken over the hedgerows, and there was already a broken vase to repair, 3 anxious servants to come, and a very great deal of work still ahead of her. She found Euphemia in the drawing room, directing a footman on the placement of a large gilt mirror, and paused in the doorway a moment before entering. Euphemia, might I have a word about the seating arrangements for supper? Euphemia did not turn around. Whatever you think is best, Theodosia. You always manage these things so much better than I could. I only ask because Lord Finshaw cannot hear well out of his left ear, and if we seat him beside the orchestra again as we did last spring, he will spend the entire meal shouting at whoever sits across from him. Then move him, Euphemia said, waving a hand toward the mirror instead of toward her sister. A little to the left, Robert. Yes, just there. Theodosia stood a moment longer, waiting for some further acknowledgement that did not come, then went to move Lord Finshaw's place card herself. In the corridor, she passed Gwendolen, who was inspecting a length of blue ribbon against her daughter Seraphina's gown with a critical eye. Theodosia, thank goodness. Do you think this ribbon suits her, or ought we try the ivory instead? The ivory, I should think. It will not fight so badly with the roses in her hair. You always know precisely the right thing, Gwendolen said warmly, already turning back to her daughter without waiting for further conversation. Whatever should we do without you? It was, Theodosia reflected privately, a question her family asked often and never once seemed inclined to answer for themselves. By 6 that evening, Thornhollow Manor had transformed into something out of a society painting. Crystal chandeliers blazed with 200 candles apiece. The ballroom floor had been polished until it gleamed like dark water. Noble families arrived in carriages that lined the drive nearly to the front gate, the women in silk gowns and pearl chokers, the men in tailored coats with gold watch chains catching the candlelight. A 12-piece orchestra played softly from the corner, and footmen in white gloves moved between clusters of guests bearing silver trays of champagne. Theodosia moved among them too, though nobody in silk or pearl seemed to notice her at all. She refilled teacups for elderly guests who complained the champagne was too strong for their constitutions. She found a chair for Lady Finshaw, 91 years old and nearly blind, and guided her to it with a gentle hand under her elbow. She noticed young Lavinia Haverlea's hem had come loose at the back and pulled her quietly into an alcove to pin it before anyone else spotted the flaw. She calmed a footman who had spilled wine on his sleeve and was convinced he would be sacked before the night ended. You will not be sacked, she told him firmly. You will change your coat, and no one will remember this happened by morning. Go. He went. Then, at 7:30, the doors opened, and every head in the ballroom turned as one. Leopold Ashbourne, Duke of Ashbourne, stepped into the room. He was not a young man, somewhere past 40, with dark hair graying handsomely at the temples and the unhurried bearing of someone who had never once needed to hurry for anything in his life. His wife, the former Lady Cressida, had died of a fever 2 years prior, and in the 2 years since, every mother in England with an unmarried daughter had attempted, and failed, to arrange an introduction. The effect of his arrival on the ballroom was immediate and almost comical. Mothers straightened their daughters' shoulders. Young women who had been laughing a moment before suddenly composed their faces into expressions of serene, marriageable dignity. Fans opened. Necklaces were adjusted. An entire generation of ambitious matchmaking began recalculating itself in real time. The Duke greeted his hosts politely, accepted a glass of wine he did not drink, and allowed himself to be introduced to no fewer than 6 unmarried daughters within the first quarter hour. He was perfectly courteous to each of them. His eyes, however, kept drifting elsewhere. They found the woman in the plain gray dress moving quietly along the edge of the room, refilling cups no one thanked her for, riding a crooked tablecloth, crouching to retrieve a dropped fan and returning it to its owner with a small, tired smile. He watched her for nearly 20 minutes before he realized he was watching her at all. "Who is that woman?" he asked Lord Finshaw. who stood beside him nursing a glass of port. Finshaw followed his gaze, squinted, and shrugged. Some aunt or other. Fenwick, I believe. Never married. Keeps the household running, from what I understand. Harmless sort. Harmless, the Duke repeated softly, and something in the word displeased him, though he could not immediately say why. He watched her comfort a young flower girl who had begun to cry near the garden doors, kneeling in her good dress to speak quietly to the child until the tears stopped. He watched her catch a servant's elbow before a tray of glasses could shatter across the floor. He watched her smile, warmly and without a trace of resentment, at people who never once looked at her directly. Not a single person thanked her. Near the punch table, the Duke's cousin, a spare, observant woman named Cressida's old friend Lady Pemberton, leaned toward him and murmured, "You have not touched your wine all evening, Leopold, yet your eyes seem quite occupied." "Merely watching the room," the Duke said. "You are watching one particular corner of the room," Lady Pemberton corrected, following his gaze toward the woman in gray currently helping an elderly gentleman find his cane. "That is the Fenwick sister. The unmarried one. I am aware. She has been on her feet since before this celebration began, I should think, and not one person here has offered her so much as a chair." "I have noticed that as well," the Duke said quietly, and something in his tone made Lady Pemberton glance at him a second time, though she said nothing further. By 8 o'clock, Theodosia's fever had climbed high enough that the edges of the room had begun to swim faintly whenever she turned her head too quickly. She pressed the back of her hand to her own forehead once, in a quiet corner, and found it burning. She did not stop. A guest near the punch table snapped her fingers for more tea, not unkindly, simply the way one snaps for a servant one does not particularly see. Theodosia lifted the heavy silver tray, 6 full cups rattling gently against their saucers, and started across the ballroom floor. Her vision swam again, worse this time. Her knees buckled. The tray left her hands entirely. It struck the marble floor with a crash loud enough that every chandelier in the room seemed to shudder. Porcelain exploded outward in a spray of white shards. Hot tea splashed across the hem of 3 separate gowns and soaked instantly into the pale Turkish carpet near the punch table. The entire ballroom went silent. For one full second, nobody moved. Then Araminta Thornhollow, the bride-to-be herself, began to laugh. "Well," she said, loudly enough for half the room to hear, "I suppose the tray has finally found someone clumsier than its owner." Seraphina Weatherby joined in immediately, delighted. Perhaps if Aunt Theodosia had spent half as much time chasing husbands as she is chasing dust, she would not still be doing this at her age. "Even the scullery maids have grandchildren by now," Lavinia Haverley added, giggling behind her gloved hand, "and she has never managed to find a single man willing to have her." Laughter rippled outward, some guests joining freely, others merely smiling behind their fans, a few looking away in visible discomfort. Not one member of Theodosia's family said a word in her defense. Theodosia knelt among the broken porcelain, her hands trembling now from both fever and humiliation, and began gathering the shattered pieces with fingers that would not entirely obey her. "I am so sorry," she said quietly, to no one in particular, to everyone at once. "I am so terribly sorry. I will clean this at once." Her hands shook harder. A sharp edge of porcelain nicked her palm, and a small bead of blood welled up, unnoticed by anyone but her. Then a second pair of hands appeared beside hers on the marble floor. Gloved, steady, unhurried. Theodosia looked up, startled, directly into the face of the Duke of Ashbourne. He said nothing at first. He simply knelt beside her in his fine coat, on the wet, tea-stained marble, and began gathering broken porcelain alongside her as though it were the most ordinary task in the world. "Your Grace," Theodosia whispered, mortified beyond speech. "Please, you needn't." "I am aware I needn't," the Duke said quietly, not unkindly. I am doing it regardless." When every visible shard had been collected into the folds of a linen napkin, the Duke rose to his full height and offered Theodosia his hand. After a stunned pause, she took it, and he helped her to her feet with the same steady care he had shown the broken china. Then he turned to face the room. The ballroom had gone utterly silent, 200 guests holding their breath at once. "Which of you?" the Duke said, his voice calm but carrying easily across the marble floor. "Cared for aging parents when they could no longer stand, dress themselves, or feed themselves alone?" Silence. "Which of you surrendered your youth, your suitors, and your own happiness so that others in your family might keep theirs entirely intact?" Still, no one answered. Araminta's smile had frozen on her face. Euphemia's teacup trembled visibly in its saucer. "I did not think so," the Duke said. He turned to Theodosia, who stood beside him with tea-stained hands and a fever burning behind her eyes, utterly at a loss for what was happening. "If the lady is willing," he said, loudly enough for every guest in the ballroom to hear clearly, "I intend to begin courting her." The ballroom erupted. A young lady near the orchestra genuinely swayed on her feet and had to be caught by her mother. An elderly baron named Oswald Draycott, startled out of a light doze, began clapping enthusiastically before realizing nothing had been formally announced, then attempted, unsuccessfully, to disguise the applause as a fit of coughing. Euphemia stared at her youngest sister as though seeing her for the very first time in 30 years. By the following morning, every drawing room in England was whispering the very same scandal. The richest widowed duke in the nation had chosen to court the spinster, and everyone else had spent decades overlooking entirely. Society, in the days that followed, largely agreed that the Duke of Ashbourne had lost his mind. Newspapers printed speculation on their front pages. Drawing rooms across 3 counties buzzed with theories. Some suggested the Duke had suffered some private grief that had unbalanced his judgment. Others whispered that Miss Fenwick must possess some hidden fortune nobody had previously known about. The truth, far stranger than either theory, remained known only to the Duke himself. At Thornhollow Manor, the transformation in the family's treatment of Theodosia was immediate and almost violent in its suddenness. Araminta, who 3 days earlier had laughed at her aunt before 200 guests, appeared at the cottage door with an enormous bouquet of hothouse roses and an expression of desperate, rehearsed warmth. "Aunt Theodosia, I have missed you terribly. I thought perhaps you might enjoy these." Theodosia accepted the roses with the same steady calm she brought to everything else, though something dry and amused flickered behind her eyes. "How lovely! I did not know roses could bloom quite so quickly from guilt, Araminta. Someone ought to write to the Horticultural Society." Araminta's smile faltered slightly, but she recovered admirably, as young women determined to marry well generally do. Privately, in the drawing room of his own townhouse 3 days after the engagement celebration, the Duke told Theodosia the truth of his intentions, and he told her plainly, without softening a single word of it. "I must be honest with you, Miss Fenwick, because you deserve nothing less," he said, standing near the cold hearth with his hands clasped behind his back. "I am not courting you because I have fallen in love with you. I scarcely know you at all." Theodosia, seated across from him with her hands folded in her lap, absorbed this without visible surprise. "I rather suspected as much, Your Grace. Society only ever seems to value a woman once a powerful man has chosen her," the Duke continued. "I watched your entire family mock the one person among them who had sacrificed the most, simply because she possessed neither wealth nor youth nor a husband to her name. It disgusted me. I want your nieces to feel the jealousy they made you feel. I want your sisters to understand precisely what they discarded. I want all of England to reconsider how it measures a woman's worth." Theodosia was quiet for a long moment. "You are angry on my behalf," she said finally. "I am angry on behalf of a principle," the Duke corrected, though something in his expression suggested he was not entirely certain of the distinction himself. Theodosia considered this, then folded her hands more firmly and looked directly at him. Very well. I will not pretend the offer does not wound my pride somewhat, Your Grace. But I have spent 30 years being useful to people who never once asked what I wanted. If being useful to your particular cause means my family finally learns some manners, I find I can live with the arrangement. And so, for the sake of avoiding further scandal and, if she was entirely honest with herself, for the sake of a curiosity she had not expected to feel, Theodosia agreed to continue the courtship. For several months that autumn, the Duke escorted her to garden parties, charity teas, concerts at the assembly rooms, the county library, and village fairs where farmers' wives stared openly and whispered behind their hands. People stared everywhere the pair went. Theodosia bore it with the same dry humor she had used her entire life to survive worse things than staring. How does it feel, Miss Fenwick? One particularly bold noblewoman asked at a garden party. To be the Duke's chosen lady? Rather like being a teapot suddenly mistaken for the crown jewels, Theodosia replied, sipping her tea. One assumes the mistake will be corrected eventually, but in the meantime, the polishing is rather nice. The Duke, standing nearby, laughed before he could stop himself. It was the first time in 2 years anyone had heard him laugh in public. Later that same afternoon, as they walked together along the garden path away from the other guests, the Duke glanced sideways at her. You are not at all what society expected me to choose, Miss Fenwick. No, Theodosia agreed. I imagine society expected someone 20 years younger, with a larger dowry and a smaller sense of humor. I confess I expected the arrangement to feel like a performance, he said. Something I would grow tired of within a fortnight. And has it? No, he admitted, looking faintly surprised by his own answer. It has not. How disappointing for your original plan, Theodosia said mildly, though she found she was watching his face rather more closely than she intended to. He laughed again, shorter this time, quieter. You make it very difficult to remain properly angry at your family, Miss Fenwick. I find I keep forgetting to resent them on your behalf, and simply enjoying your company instead. A serious flaw in your scheme, Your Grace. I should think a man plotting revenge on an ungrateful family ought not enjoy the company of his chosen instrument quite so openly. A serious flaw indeed, he agreed, and neither of them said anything further for a long moment, though the silence between them had none of the discomfort silence usually carries. What neither of them had anticipated was how quickly the arrangement stopped feeling like an arrangement at all. Freed, for the first time in decades, from the daily grind of caregiving, Theodosia revealed a mind shaped by 30 years of quietly observing human nature at its most desperate and its most honest. She had spent years reading illness and grief and loneliness in the smallest movements of a person's face, and that skill translated, it turned out, remarkably well to the drawing rooms and estate offices of the aristocracy. She noticed a tenant dispute brewing on the Duke's land 3 weeks before his steward noticed it, simply from the way two families avoided each other at the village market. You ought to speak with the Marlowe family and the Higgins family separately before Sunday, she told the Duke over tea one afternoon. The Marlowes believe the Higgins boy let his cattle graze on their side of the boundary fence on purpose. It was almost certainly an accident, but pride does not care much for facts once it gets started. The Duke sent his steward to investigate. The dispute, exactly as she predicted, resolved itself within the week. How did you know that? He asked her, genuinely startled. I spent 30 years learning how ordinary people behave when they feel unheard, Theodosia said simply. It is not so different whether the person is a duke's tenant or a dying man asking for water at 3 in the morning. The Duke began seeking her opinion before making decisions he once would have made entirely alone. Gradually, the public appearances that had begun as calculated performance became something closer to genuine anticipation. Conversation replaced obligation. Laughter replaced careful public posturing. One rainy afternoon in October, Theodosia attempted to bake scones in the small kitchen of her cottage while the Duke waited in her modest sitting room, and produced something so dense and hard that the Duke, upon biting into one, nearly cracked a tooth. These, he announced solemnly, turning the scone over in his hand, could reinforce a castle wall. They are firm, Theodosia agreed, entirely unbothered. Firmness is a virtue, Your Grace. Ask any spinster. The Duke laughed until actual tears gathered at the corners of his eyes, laughed harder than he had laughed since long before his wife's death, laughed the way a man laughs when grief finally loosens its grip on his chest for just a moment. Neither of them noticed, in that ordinary, rain-soaked afternoon over rock-hard scones, that the courtship built entirely on pride and principle had quietly, without either of their permission, become something else altogether. The agreed months of courtship drew to their natural close as the first frost settled over the county. Theodosia arrived at the Duke's townhouse on a gray November afternoon, dressed plainly as always, and thanked him with quiet sincerity for what he had done. "You have given me something my own family never managed to give me in 30 years, Your Grace," she said, standing near the window with her hands folded before her. "The chance to be seen as something other than useful. I am grateful for it, truly. I will return to my cottage now, and you need not concern yourself with me further. Your point has been made most thoroughly." She turned to leave. "Miss Fenwick," the Duke said, and something in his voice made her stop with her hand already on the door. "Wait," he said. "Please." He did not speak again inside the townhouse, where portraits of his ancestors watched from every wall and the weight of his own title pressed down on every word he might say. Instead, he asked her to walk with him and led her out to the ancient oak tree at the edge of his estate, far from newspapers, far from gossiping drawing rooms, far from any audience at all. There, beneath bare branches with the cold air biting at both their faces, the Duke finally said what he had not planned to say. "I began this courtship to teach your family a lesson," he said. "I intended it as a punishment for their cruelty and a correction for society's blindness. That much was true, and I will not pretend otherwise." "I know," Theodosia said quietly. "But you did not simply teach my target," he continued. "You taught me something I did not know I still needed learning. I believed happiness had already finished with me the day I buried my wife. I believed the rest of my life would simply be duty, dressed up as living." He paused, searching for words that did not come easily to a man unaccustomed to saying them aloud. "You brought laughter back into my house before I even realized it had left. You gave me wiser counsel than any advisor I employ. You showed me that love sometimes arrives disguised as friendship, so quietly that a man does not notice it has arrived until it has already settled permanently into his chest." He took both her hands in his, cold and bare against the November air. "I am asking you to marry me," he said, "not to prove a point to society, not to punish anyone further. I am asking because I love you, Theodosia, and because I cannot imagine a single remaining year of my life without your dry humor correcting my every foolish decision." Theodosia laughed through sudden tears, pressing one hand briefly to her mouth. "You are rather late, Your Grace." "So are you," he said, and smiled. They were married 3 weeks later in the small stone church at the edge of the village, the same church where Theodosia had once, decades earlier, received a handful of crushed wildflowers from a young man who had long since forgotten her entirely. The wedding was not extravagant. It did not need to be. Word of it traveled through England regardless, not because of the size of the guest list or the cost of the flowers, but because it reminded an entire nation that love could still arrive long after the world had decided a woman's chances were finished. The elderly village vicar, a kindly, forgetful man named Lysander Thaddeus Whitmore, wept so freely through the ceremony that he genuinely lost track of which ring belonged to which hand. and had to be gently redirected by his own curate halfway through the vows. Isolde, now a senior housemaid at Thornhollow Manor and no longer the trembling girl who once feared dismissal over a dropped candlestick, stood near the back of the church clutching a handkerchief of her own. "I never thought I would see this day," she whispered to the footman beside her. "Miss Fenwick, a duchess. She once sat with me for an hour after I dropped that candlestick, just so I would stop crying. She sat with half this village at one time or another." The footman murmured back, "It is only right that someone finally sits with her." At the front of the church, the Duke watched Theodosia walk toward him in her simple ivory gown, and found, to his own quiet surprise, that his hands were not entirely steady. Araminta cried harder than anyone in the small church, harder even than her own mother. "We truly believed she had missed her chance at life," she whispered to Serafina, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "No," Serafina whispered back, watching their aunt at the altar, radiant in a simple ivory gown. "She was too busy giving her chance at life to the rest of us." By the time the newlywed Duke and Duchess climbed into the waiting carriage outside the church, Theodosia Fenwick, once dismissed as the useless unmarried aunt, had become the Duchess of Ashbourne. Marriage, Theodosia discovered within her first month at Ashbourne Park, did not change who she fundamentally was. It simply gave the rest of the world permission to finally notice her. She did not spend her days competing over lace patterns or trading gossip in overheated drawing rooms, the way many of the Duke's aristocratic acquaintances clearly expected her to. Instead, within her first week as Duchess, she walked the length of the estate's kitchens, spoke directly with the cook about waste in the larder, and discovered that nearly a fifth of the household's food budget was quietly disappearing into spoiled stores that nobody had bothered to properly track. "We shall need a proper ledger for the kitchen stores," she told the Duke's steward, a nervous, precise man named Ambrose Kettering, and someone checking it weekly. "I imagine you have been far too occupied with the tenant accounts to notice the kitchens at all." Ambrose, startled that anyone above the rank of cook had ever cared about kitchen waste, agreed immediately. Within 3 months, the estate's food costs had dropped considerably, and the savings were quietly redirected toward better wages for the household's youngest servants, several of whom had been surviving on wages that had not increased in over a decade. She visited the tenant farms personally, something the Duke's first wife had never once done in 8 years of marriage. She listened to complaints about a leaking roof on the Higgins farm and had it repaired within the week. She remembered the names of every tenant's children, their ages, their small ailments, the way she had once remembered every detail of her own family's needs out of decades of necessity. "You look as though you were born to be a duchess," Aunt Araminta told her once, visiting Ashbourne Park with her new husband, Bramwell Montclair, on their own honeymoon tour. "No, dear," Theodosia said, pouring tea with the same steady hands that had once carried a heavier tray toward disaster. "I was born to be useful." The title has simply given people spectacles to finally see it properly. One evening, at a formal supper attended by several visiting families of considerable rank, an older baroness leaned across the table and asked, with poorly disguised curiosity, "Tell me, Duchess, how does a woman of your particular history come to manage a household so very well?" The table quieted slightly, several guests clearly expecting Theodosia to falter under the pointed question. "I imagine much the same way any woman manages a household well, Baroness," Theodosia replied evenly, buttering a roll without hurry. "By paying attention to what actually needs doing, rather than to what looks impressive while it is being done. But you have no formal training in the management of an estate of this size." "I have 30 years of formal training in the management of a household with far less money and far more urgent problems," Theodosia said. "A leaking roof does not care whether the woman fixing the arrangement for it was born a duchess or a spinster aunt. It only cares whether the arrangement gets made before the rain arrives." The Baroness, apparently unable to locate a suitable response, changed the subject to the weather instead, and the Duke, seated at the head of the table, had to press his napkin briefly to his mouth to hide his own smile. The Duke, watching her move through his grand halls with the same quiet confidence she had once used in sick rooms and kitchens, found himself falling more thoroughly in love with her every single week. He caught her more than once sneaking pies out to the stable boys, claiming loudly and unconvincingly that she was merely inspecting the pastry's quality for freshness. "Your inspections," he told her one afternoon, brushing a crumb from her glove with obvious amusement, "always seem to leave the evidence directly on your gloves, Theodosia." "An occupational hazard of thorough inspection, Your Grace," she said, entirely unashamed. Their romance, once built on pride and public performance, deepened instead through small, unglamorous, entirely human gestures. Shared tea at dawn before the household woke. Quiet walks through the winter garden, their breath fogging in the cold air. Long evening conversations about the years each of them had separately lost, and the strange, undeserved gift of finding each other so late. Her sisters, visiting Ashbourne Park with increasing frequency that spring, began to notice, slowly and with visible discomfort, exactly how much wisdom they had spent 30 years ignoring. Under the new Duchess's quiet guidance, Ashbourne Park flourished in ways nobody, least of all the Duke himself, had entirely anticipated. Harvests improved as tenant disputes settled and farmers finally felt heard rather than merely managed. The kitchens ran efficiently for the first time in a generation. Servants who had once expected to be dismissed over minor mistakes discovered instead a mistress who understood, better than anyone, precisely how much a person could endure before breaking. Theodosia opened a charitable kitchen in the village for widows and orphans within her first year as Duchess, funded partly from the very savings she had identified in the estate's own larder. "It seems only fitting," she told the Duke, "that food we once wasted should feed people who have none at all." A small schoolhouse followed the next spring, built at the edge of the village for children whose families could not otherwise afford tutors. And within 2 years, Theodosia had established something she had wanted, quietly and desperately, for 30 years without ever once saying so aloud. A comfortable home for elderly people with no family left to care for them. "No one who spends a lifetime caring for others," she told the Duke firmly, standing over the foundation stones of the new building, "should grow old feeling unwanted. I know precisely what that feels like, and I will not allow it to happen to another soul in this county while I have breath left to prevent it." The manor itself, meanwhile, filled steadily with life. Nieces and nephews who had once treated their aunt as invisible furniture began arriving at Ashbourne Park with their own young children, eager, in the way that guilt often makes people eager, for their sons and daughters to know the aunt they themselves had once so carelessly overlooked. The nursery at Ashbourne Park, empty and silent for years after the Duke's first marriage, produced no children, filled with the noise of carved cradles and toddling feet. Great-nieces and great-nephews hid beneath the long dining table during family dinners. Children chased the Duke's spaniels across the garden while nannies pretended, with limited success, to be horrified by the resulting chaos. The Duke himself took to carrying small children on his shoulders through the estate's gardens, loudly insisting that every child required a proper adventure before supper, regardless of how their nannies felt about the mud on their good shoes. Theodosia welcomed each new arrival with biscuits, quiet stories, gentle discipline when discipline was needed, and the same dry humor that had carried her through 30 harder years. When one small great-niece asked her, quite innocently, why she had never had children of her own, Theodosia only smiled. "I had a great many children, dear," she said. "They simply all arrived already related to me, and most of them were very badly behaved indeed." The child giggled, entirely unaware she was one of the badly behaved children in question. Her sisters, gathered at Ashbourne Park for a summer visit that year, watched their own grandchildren tumble across the lawn under Theodosia's watchful eye and finally admitted, quietly, among themselves, what none of them had wanted to say aloud for 30 years. Every happy memory our children possess, Honoria said one evening, watching Theodosia patiently braid a granddaughter's tangled hair, depended entirely on what our sister sacrificed. We simply never once thought to thank her for it. We spent years trying to teach her how to properly live, Gwendolyn added dryly, watching Theodosia settle an argument between two squabbling children with a single raised eyebrow. It turns out she was only ever waiting for the rest of us to finally catch up to her. Later that evening, Araminta found her aunt alone on the terrace, watching the sun sink behind the tree line, and sat beside her without quite knowing how to begin. Aunt Theodosia, I have wanted to say something to you for a long time, and I have never quite managed the courage. You may say it now, dear. The terrace is patient. I am sorry, Araminta said, her voice unsteady, for that evening at the manor. For years of evenings before it, if I am honest, I laughed at you in front of 200 people, and I do not believe I ever properly apologized for it. Theodosia was quiet a moment, watching the last light fade over the garden she had helped design herself. You were young, and you had been taught, without anyone meaning to teach you cruelly, that a woman's worth could be measured by a wedding ring, she said finally. I forgave you the moment the Duke helped me off that floor, Araminta, though I confess it took me rather longer to forgive myself for believing, all those years, that the mockery might have been deserved. It was never deserved, Araminta said fiercely. No, Theodosia agreed, patting her niece's hand. I know that now. It took a stranger to teach me, when it ought to have been my own family. But I have learned it all the same, and that is what matters in the end. They sat together on the terrace until the last light disappeared entirely, saying very little more, needing very little more said. The years that followed passed gently, the way years do when two people have finally stopped waiting for happiness and simply settled into living it. The Duke and Duchess walked the gardens together every morning regardless of weather, shared tea by the fire on winter evenings, laughed over jokes so old between them that neither could remember their original punchlines, and watched the children of a once mocking family grow steadily into young adults of genuine kindness. The happiest years of my life, the Duke told her once, sitting beside her on a garden bench with late afternoon sun warming both their faces, began at precisely the moment I believed happiness had already finished with me entirely. Together, they expanded their charitable work steadily across the county. More homes were built for elderly people without families. The village school grew large enough to require a second teacher. A modest medical fund was established to cover the cost of a doctor's visits for tenant families who could not otherwise afford one, a decision Theodosia insisted upon after remembering, with painful clarity, how often her own aging parents had gone without proper care simply because proper care cost more than the family could spare. Eventually, after many contented years together, the Duke passed away peacefully in his sleep, his hand resting in hers exactly as it had rested every night for over a decade. In the letter he left for her, sealed and placed in her hands by his solicitor, he had written plainly, I first approached you intending only to teach an ungrateful family and an ungrateful society a lesson about the value they had so carelessly overlooked. Instead, I found the greatest companion of my entire life. My title, my estate, and my fortune were never my true inheritance, Theodosia. You were, I hope, in whatever years remain to you. You understand at last precisely how deeply you were loved and how deeply you deserve to be. Theodosia continued their charitable work for many years afterward, growing old herself, though never once treated as a burden the way she had once feared growing old alone might feel. At the final family gathering held in her honor, decades after that humiliating evening in the Thornhollow ballroom, Her three sisters stood before their assembled children and grandchildren and confessed, at last, and without excuse, the greatest mistake of their shared lives. We measured a woman's worth by whether a man had married her early, Euphemia said, her voice steady despite her age, and we very nearly cost ourselves the wisest, kindest member of our entire family because of it. A young great-granddaughter, no older than 7, tugged at her mother's sleeve and asked, with the blunt honesty only children possess, why everyone was crying if the Duchess had lived such a wonderful life. An elderly relative, one of the very servants Theodosia had once comforted decades earlier over a dropped candlestick, now gray-haired herself, knelt down to answer the child gently. Because she spent her entire life making everyone else's burdens lighter, she said. And most of us did not notice or thank her properly for it, until it was very nearly too late. The story of Theodosia Fenwick, once dismissed by her own family as the useless unmarried aunt, closed not with her death, but with the sound of children laughing through the gardens of the estate she had quietly transformed. She had not merely become a duchess. She had become the reason an entire family finally learned gratitude. And she had become the reason a lonely, grieving duke discovered, against every expectation, that love can still arrive long after the world has decided a person's story has already ended.